Author. Um, by 1924-25, Hitler's out of prison, and he made one other pledge, and the other pledge was that he would never do anything illegal to try to take over the German government again, and he didn't. For the next few years, he and the Nazis will organize. They will certainly threaten and they will bully and they will do a lot of things going on in German politics, but he will run in elections. And in 1933, the Nazi Party will gain 44% of the popular vote. Not a majority so they can run the government, but enough that they would be the major party. They joined with some smaller conservative parties, and Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933 with a coalition government. In 1936, an event will occur that will enable him to take complete control over Germany. In 1936, the Reichstag, Reichstag, the Reichstag. The Reichstag is the legislative assembly of Germany, but it's also the building in which they meet. So the Reichstag meets in the Reichstag. The Reichstag burned to the ground. Now, nobody was sure who did it at the time, and nobody's sure to this day. Some people blamed socialists, some people blamed Jews, some people blamed communists, some people even said the Nazis themselves did. Hitler declared it was the communists, and he declared martial law in Germany. In order to protect Germans, we declare martial law, and he began to eliminate enemies throughout Germany, and that included communists, of course, the natural enemy of fascists, but this included a full attack on the Jews, a full attack on gypsies, and he began to imprison them. Prison them in what are first known as work camps and then concentration camps. We know that eventually in these camps, over 6 million Jews will be executed, sent to the gas chambers and executed. But over 11 million people were actually executed, including gypsies, homosexuals, the handicapped, people that the Nazis felt did not fit in their new perfect Germany. 1936 enabled Hitler to take complete control of the government. So now he has to decide, what am I going to do? Well, he's made certain promises and he had certain goals. One was to break the Versailles Treaty, for Germany to show the world that they would not be held to these restraints. In 1936, he decided that the way he would test this and show this is to send troops into an area of Germany called the Rhineland. Now, the Rhineland was in western Germany, bordered with France. It was an area of factories, industrialization. Between the wars, the French were famous for going in and dismantling factories and bringing them back to France and calling them reparations. The Versailles Treaty had said that no German army, no German troops could occupy the Rhineland. So this was a free, open area in which the French often exploited. In 1936, Hitler sent troops in to Rhineland to see if anybody would do anything about it. The result was nobody did anything. By this time, Italy, of course, is a fascist state. France is too politically unstable to really do anything. I'm not sure they should. And the British, trying to create a welfare state, don't want to have to sacrifice their wealth and their goals to do something that many argued really was ridiculous anyway. This is German territory. If they wanted to occupy it with their own German troops, that shouldn't be a problem. But them enabling Hitler to invade and send troops into the Rhineland gave Hitler the green light. It showed him that the Allies were not going to stop him. Now, having said that, let's move quickly over to the United States. In the early 1930s, the United States had gone through a period of over a decade of really trying to be isolationist. We had been disillusioned by our experience in World War I, and we felt that we had not really gotten the democracy, the freedom, the liberty that we thought we had been fighting for. And so, at least politically, we tried to be isolationists. Economically, we remained very much global with our trade and business. But politically, we tried to stay out. So we didn't join the League of Nations. And while we signed some international treaties, we did not try to get involved with alliances too deeply. In the early 1930s, as the Great Depression was going on, the United States tried to legislate peace. We passed a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts. Neutrality Acts attempted to create legislation that would prevent the United States from ever getting involved in future wars. For instance, one Neutrality Act said that private businesses and banks could not lend money to countries at war. Um, that was one reason many believed we got involved in the First World War, because of loans we had made to the warring powers. Another was that we couldn't sell military equipment to nations at war. So we tried to stay neutral in all of these events. Now, back over to Europe. In 1936, Spain had an election. It's a free and open election, democracy, and the Communist Party of Spain won the election. There were, however, many people throughout Spain who didn't want to be ruled by the fascists, and in fact opposed it strongly, including many Catholics and businessmen and other groups. And they began to form around a man named Franco, General Franco, who declared himself to be a fascist. Now, while General Franco was certainly a military authority, dictator, his fascism was somewhat weak. He was a little too close to the Catholic Church and other areas and businesses to be involved as a true fascist, but he declared himself to be a fascist. And he immediately called out to the fascist nations, Italy and Germany, and said, I'm fighting against the communists, I'm fighting against this illegal government, will you support me? Germany and Italy both supported the fascists in Spain by sending military equipment and money. But primarily important event was the issue was the military equipment. Germany and Italy sent Franco the best stuff they had. And they did so primarily because they wanted to test it. There's no better place to test military equipment than an actual war. So they sent the best that they had. The Communist Party of Spain also sent out word for help. Will you not help us? Of course, they sent word out to Stalin in Russia. But Stalin in Russia was in no position to help Spain. They could barely help themselves. They sent word to the Western powers, to France, to Britain. So will you help us? Neither of these countries were anxious to get involved in the war and deal with the expense. The United States, while they certainly supported democracy, were not ready to support a communist state or communist party. And we had not really liked the Bolshevik Revolution. We believed the United States was the opposite of everything that communism was, and saw Russia as a natural enemy, and therefore communism a natural enemy. So we weren't really eager to support the Spanish government. As a result, between 1936 and 1939, we had the Spanish Civil War, in which Franco eventually, by 1939, will be victorious and will conquer, defeat the communist government and take control of Spain. Let's change gears and switch over to Asia for the moment. Japan and the United States at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, were really the two fastest growing empires in Asia. And the United States, with its headquarters in the Philippines, had begun to expand its naval and military power and economic might, just as Japan was doing the same. By 1937, Japan, attempting to gain more territory, land, and people and resources in order to compete with the West, had invaded China. Now, they had invaded Manchuria back in 1931, but there had been a wording, an argument there. The Japanese said, we've been invited to Manchuria, we've set up a separate republic, even though most international observers said, no, this is a dictatorship and this isn't real. But nonetheless, there was an argument. Enough of an argument, nobody wanted to go to war over this. But when Japan invaded China in 1937, this is really when the conflict began. Now you can begin to see that while the Western powers were not ready to declare war on Japan in 1937, you can begin to see that the conflict is almost becoming inevitable. By 1940, the United States and Japan were still economic partners. The United States, on one hand, was sending oil, scrap metal, and all the material that Japan needed for their war, while politically condemning them. So we made money all the way through 1941 with that Japanese trade, but at the same time condemned them politically for their military adventures. Simultaneously, by the end of 1941, the United States had broken the Japanese secret code. This is always a big issue with World War II in the beginning of it. How much did the United States know and not know about Japan's plans? First of all, before we talk about Japan's plans, I understand is that this is 1940, 1941. Uh, you can't, it's not easy to get secret radio messages or secret written messages. When we got them and they were in the Japanese code, we could decode them. But it's not like we could just reach down and grab a message. So we got bits and pieces. Now, what exactly was the Japanese plan? Well, first the question is, did Japan believe they could defeat the United States in an all-out war? And the answer is, well, no, of course not. And the United States had two things the Japanese did not have. The United States had a much larger population and a much larger industrial base. However, the Japanese had learned something from the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. In the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese had fought against Russia over who was going to exploit Korea. They took a lot of territory and then sued for peace. Russia was defeated, but in fact, in the peace treaty, the Japanese gave back enough that the Russians were allowed to end the war and to essentially save face. The same idea went for the Japanese plan with the United States. If they could hit the United States hard, destroy the fleet, make it very expensive in money and human lives to go to war against Japan, they could then negotiate a peace and possibly end up with what they wanted anyway. So if we take a huge amount of land and then and destroy as much of the United States Navy as possible, and then sue for peace and say, okay, we'll give back a large amount of that, but we want to keep some of it. We could end this before all-out war breaks out, saving the United States billions of dollars and who knows how many lives. And really, the United States would, at least internationally, be able to show, see, we made them back down. And the Japanese ended up with pretty much what they wanted in the first place. So if you believe war is inevitable, then for the Japanese, this kind of made sense. It's hit them hard and fast and make it so expensive they're not going to want to fight back. In November 1941, the United States was aware, through breaking the code, that the Japanese fleet had left Japan and was heading into the Pacific. The question is, where were they going? The obvious answer would have been, of course, the Philippines. And a large part of the Japanese Navy did go to the Philippines and attack the Philippines. But another part went to Hawaii, where the United States Naval Fleet was stationed. Part of that plan of this destroy their Navy, make it difficult for them to rebuild or expensive to rebuild, and bring them to negotiate. On the 7th of December, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And destroyed much of the fleet there. On the next day, on the 8th of December 1941, Roosevelt, who had always seen Germany as the real threat and Japan as a secondary threat, nonetheless, Roosevelt declared war on Japan. A day in infamy, he said, the 7th of December, a day in infamy, day that we'll remember in history. 3 days later, Adolf Hitler did something he's really not known for. He had signed an alliance with Russia and Japan back in 1939 that was an Axis powers alliance that said Japan and then Germany would be military allies. As a result of this, on the 11th of December, he declared war on Japan, or on the United States, an alliance with Japan, which gave Roosevelt exactly what he wanted. Roosevelt really thought Germany was the threat. So even though we were at war with Japan, Roosevelt now turns all of his attention westward to Europe, which brings us back to Germany. 1936, the burning of the Reichstag, the reoccupation of the Rhineland. And in 1938, Hitler decided to expand his ambitions. He had already said that he intended on including all German speakers in the new Reich. He was going to include Eastern Europe. So he set his sights on the largest German-speaking state that neighbored him, and that was Austria. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria without really much opposition. All right, we'll get back to that in a minute.